After World War II, the horrors of the Third Reich seem to have been buried along with its ambitions, but some shadows of the past never truly disappear. They just wait in silence. In the brutal winter of 1947, the US government launched Operation High Jump, a military expedition to Antarctica led by Admiral Richard Byrd. Officially, it was a training exercise to prepare troops for extreme conditions. Officially, what those soldiers found among the frozen peaks and relentless storms was never recorded in history books. Ancient structures, inscriptions in languages no man had ever read, and signs that the Nazis had uncovered something that was never meant to be disturbed. Now, years later, a new classified mission is underway. A team of archaeologists, military personnel, and scientists is sent to investigate the remains of what was once Base 211, the legendary Nazi outpost buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice. What they discover defies all logic. The ice isn't just ice, the ruins aren't just stone. And something is still alive down there, trapped in time, waiting to be awakened. As the team begins to disappear one by one, isolation and paranoia consume the survivors. The cold is unforgiving, but the real terror doesn't come from the temperature. It comes from whatever is watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And in the deadly silence of Antarctica, only one thing is certain. If the ice breaks again, the entire world will pay the price. I'm going to tell this story exactly as it happened. No embellishments, no dramatics, just the facts. I don't know what we saw in that base. I don't know if it was real or just our minds playing tricks on us. But I do know one thing, I never want to set foot in Antarctica again. It was 1953. The world was deep in the Cold War, and any military or technological advantage was worth its weight in gold. The US Navy had its eyes on an old Nazi installation in Antarctica, Base 211. Officially, the mission was a routine investigation. Unofficially, well, no one said it out loud. But everyone on the team knew something was off. I was assigned. As the communications officer, my job was to ensure that any intel coming from that base reached high command without interference. The team was small but carefully selected. Commander John Reynolds, a hardened veteran, the kind of guy who wouldn't flinch even if the world was falling apart. Dr. William Carter, an archaeologist and expert in ancient languages. Brilliant, but always a little distant, like he was analyzing something the rest of us couldn't see. Emily Rhodes, a cryptographer, expert in classified codes and documents. Young, determined, and if I may say so, way too skeptical for what we were. About to find Dr. Samuel Walker, a scientist and Navy researcher specializing in electromagnetic phenomena. He was way too excited for a mission like this. Our starting point was an advanced Navy outpost on the Antarctic coast. We flew in, facing a cold so intense it felt like it could cut straight through bone. As soon as we landed, the base captain met us in the hangar. He looked anything but comfortable to see us. He handed us a classified dossier. The first thing that caught my eye was a red-marked note, written in bold letters. Base 211 was evacuated in 1943. Reason unknown. That alone was unsettling. But then I saw the next line. U.S. expedition sent in 1952. All personnel missing. None of us said a word, but the silence in the room was heavy. I should have backed out right then and there, but it was already too late. The flight to the Navy's forward base lasted long hours, cutting through an oppressive gray sky, flying over miles and miles of an endless white desert. The silence was absolute. No life, no movement, just ice, like the planet itself had stopped breathing. When the plane finally touched down on the makeshift runway, the cold hit us like a wall. This wasn't normal cold. It was the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your skin burn, that made the air feel thick and heavy. We grabbed our gear and headed toward the barracks. The base should have been busy, at least with a small support team waiting for us. But the moment we stepped into the main building, we noticed the smell, or rather, the lack of one. There was no mold, no rust, no burnt oil like you'd expect in a place like this. Instead, everything seemed too normal, as if the people had just stepped out. The heaters were still on. Fluorescent lights flickered. Old computers hummed softly, their static screens flashing. In the dorms, beds were neatly made. Lockers held folded clothes, personal belongings scattered about. In the mess hall, dirty plates sat on tables, food, frozen solid from the cold, but there was no one. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. The team split up to investigate. Reynolds checked the base's communication system. Carter examined the documents left behind. Walker tried to access the climate sensors. Emily and I went to the radio room, and that's when we heard it. Through the static, a short, fragmented transmission in German. A male voice, distorted, repeating something, its words breaking through the interference. Wacht. Der Schläfer wacht. Walker frowned. The sleeper. He wakes. He murmured, translating for us. The phrase repeated 3 times before the signal went silent. Whatever was transmitting that signal shouldn't exist. There were no active transmitters. Emily started adjusting the controls, scanning for the signal source. Then suddenly she froze. Her hand stopped on the panel, her face turned pale. Did you hear that? Hear what? I asked. She swallowed hard, her eyes wide. Someone called my name. At that moment, Reynolds stepped into the room. Get some rest. We leave for the ruins at first light. No one argued. But that night, as I lay awake in the silent barracks, the walls creaking under the weight of the frozen wind, I couldn't stop, thinking about one thing. Emily said someone called her name, but the radio had been silent. We left the forward base at dawn. The freezing wind made the air feel heavier, and the sunlight reflecting off the ice cast everything in a sickly, pale glow. The journey to Base 211 took hours. When we finally reached the location marked on the maps, we found what appeared to be the main entrance, a structure of concrete and steel, partially buried under the snow. The door was ajar. No signs of an explosion. No forced entry, just open, as if someone had left a long time ago and never came back. Reynolds made us wait while he checked the interior with a flashlight. After a few minutes, he signaled for us to move in. Base 211 was intact. The underground. Corridors were long, cold, lined with metal corroded by time. The first few rooms we entered were abandoned command stations, dust-covered maps, scattered documents, equipment frozen in time. Carter picked up one of the papers and frowned. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the document toward us. "These reports are from 1943, but some pages have been censored. Entire sections blacked out with thick ink. But by who? The Nazis themselves? The American government? Someone else?" We kept moving. The hallway stretched like a labyrinth, spiraling. Deeper. The air felt heavier. The walls were coated in ice, but here and there we saw something strange. Markings etched into the metal. Symbols that even Carter couldn't identify. Then we found the gate. It was massive. A towering structure of dark metal, untouched by rust, completely different from the rest of the base. It didn't look man-made. It looked ancient. Far older than the Nazis. Older than anything that should be here. Strange patterns and symbols were engraved across its surface. Emily ran her hand over them, fascinated. "This isn't German. It's not Latin. It's not anything I've ever seen before." Carter snapped photos and scribbled notes, but his face showed something between confusion and fear. "This structure," he hesitated. "The Nazis didn't build this, they found it." Reynolds' radio crackled. Everyone froze. A muffled, distorted voice whispered through the static, low, distant, wacht. The same phrase we heard at the forward base, but this time, we weren't hearing it over the radio. The sound was coming from behind the gate. Walker set up his equipment near the massive gate, while Carter flipped through the scattered documents on the floor. The place felt frozen in time, abandoned for years, yet something wasn't right. The air itself seemed to hum, as if an invisible weight pressed down on us. "This doesn't make sense," Walker muttered, adjusting his sensors. "What is it?" I asked, trying not to sound tense. He turned to me, eyes unfocused, like he was struggling to process something impossible. "This gate is emitting an electromagnetic signal in steady pulses, like a heartbeat." Nobody answered. Nobody knew what to say. Carter continued digging through the documents. He pulled out an old yellowed notebook, stamped with the Nazi emblem. He flipped through a few pages and suddenly his face went pale. "I think I just found the reason this base was evacuated." He handed the journal to Reynolds, who read out loud. "First came the dreams, then the whispers. Then the men started, seeing things that weren't there. Some went mad, some took their own lives. But the worst were the ones who started hearing the voice. They wanted to open the gate. A heavy silence fell over us. This was written by a Nazi officer," Carter said, his voice low. "They abandoned the base because something was messing with their minds." Reynolds shut the notebook. "We're leaving now." He turned to Emily and Walker. "One last sweep of the corridors. Grab anything useful, and we're heading back to the forward base. I don't want anyone here after dark." No one argued. That night we were all exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. The barracks at the forward base were quiet. But not the right kind of quiet. It was a silence that felt forced, unnatural, like something was waiting for us to sleep. Emily was the first to drift off, but then it happened. She murmured in her sleep, her breathing ragged, then her face twisted in pure terror. And without warning, she screamed. Reynolds and I rushed to her bunk. She jolted awake, gasping for air, her eyes wide, completely lost. "What happened?" I asked, trying to steady her. She looked at us like she was still there, still trapped in the dream. I saw a room, no light, no walls, just endless darkness. And there were figures around me, tall, human, but faceless. They didn't move. They just watched me, and I felt like they were waiting for something. The radio crackled. All of us turned our heads at the same time. The static grew louder. Then, through the distortion, we heard it. Wacht. The same whisper. The same voice. Reynolds swallowed hard. "That came from the radio?" I asked, my mouth dry. He took a moment before answering. "The radio is off." The next morning, Walker was gone. We searched the barracks, the hallways, even the frozen perimeter of the forward base. But he had vanished. The only thing we found were footprints in the snow, leading away from the base. He had left alone, in the middle of the night. But why? Where was he going? "This doesn't make sense," Reynolds muttered. He would never leave without telling someone. The radio was silent. No response. No signal. It was like he had just disappeared. 2. 3 hours later, he came back. We found him near the access tunnel to Base 211, stumbling aimlessly through the snow. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, and his eyes were empty. It was like he didn't see us, like he wasn't really there. Carter and Reynolds grabbed him by the arms, trying to get him to focus. He only mumbled, his voice dry and distant, repeating phrases that made no sense. "The gate is waiting. There is no time here. They want to open it." His eyes were hollow, lifeless. When we finally brought him back inside, he collapsed onto his bed. When he woke up, he remembered nothing. But Walker wasn't the only one acting strange that morning. Emily went to the bathroom and stayed there for a long time. Too long. After a while, I went to check on her. The door was slightly open. She was standing in front of the mirror, completely still. "Emily?" She didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, feeling a deep chill in my spine. And then, it happened. Her reflection blinked. First, before Emily jumped back, gasping. "Did you see that?" "I saw it." I swear to God I saw it, but how do you explain something like that? How do you accept it? "It was just the glass," I tried to say, but we both knew it wasn't the glass. She just stared at me, saying nothing. We both walked out of that bathroom, like we had just stepped into a place we were never supposed to be. Meanwhile, Carter wouldn't stop reading through the Nazi documents. He was obsessed. At some point, he called Reynolds over and opened one of the old journals, pointing at a rushed, nearly illegible entry. It speaks in the minds of men. It shapes them. It makes them a part of itself. This isn't just some hallucination, Carter murmured. This is a pattern, like something is getting inside their heads. Reynolds didn't speak for a long time. Then, he looked at me. Carter, Emily, and Walker, still unconscious on his bed. And then he said something that chilled me to my core. What if we haven't been the same since we stepped inside that place? No one answered, but we were all thinking the same thing. What if he was right? The decision was unanimous. We would evacuate at dawn. No one said it out loud, but it was clear something was wrong with us. Walker didn't remember where he had been. Emily avoided looking at any reflective surface. Carter grew more and more, disturbed by the documents he was reading. And Reynolds? Well, he no longer seemed sure that we were still the same team. I just wanted to get out. But Antarctica had other plans. That night, the storm hit. The wind howled, like the ice itself was screaming. The gusts shook the entire base, making the walls groan under the pressure. The snow hammered against the windows like fists pounding to get inside. We were trapped, and then things got worse. Emily was the first to notice. She was sitting on her bunk when she saw something on the wall beside her bed, something that hadn't been there before. Words, scratched into the metal, carved with something sharp. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the letters. The handwriting was familiar. It was hers, but she had no memory of writing it. "You shouldn't be here." When she called us over, no one knew what to say. The message was there, clear as day, and the worst part? When she compared it to her own journal, it was identical to her handwriting. "Did one of you do this?" Her voice was hollow, emotionless. No one answered, because we knew no one had done it. Meanwhile, Carter paced back and forth, restless. "Something's wrong." "No kidding," I muttered. He stopped suddenly, eyes wide. "How many were in our expedition?" I frowned. "What? How many of us are here?" "4 plus Reynolds, 5. He shook his head. "No, that's not right. What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, scanning the room, like he was trying to remember something just out of reach. "I swear, I feel like there was a 6th. Remember? Reynolds overheard and cut in, his face dark. "There was no one else. It's always been 5. But Carter shook his head slowly. "No. There was someone else. I remember a 6th person, but I can't remember their face." Silence fell over the room. We all looked at each other, waiting for someone to call Carter crazy. But the worst part, for just a moment I felt it too. Like someone had been erased, like we had left someone behind. And then for the first time I saw Reynolds hesitate. He looked at each of us one by one, and his expression changed, like he wasn't sure he still recognized his own team. The storm still raged outside, keeping us trapped. The wind made the metal groan, and the cold felt sharper than it should have been. But inside the base, something far worse was happening. No one spoke about it, but you could see it on our faces. We didn't trust each other anymore. Walker kept staring at the floor, lost in thought. Emily barely spoke. Carter was obsessed with the documents, and Reynolds. Well, Reynolds looked drained, like something was eating away at his mind. It was Carter who suggested we go back to the gate. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," he said, gripping his papers a little too tightly. It was a terrible idea, but we went anyway. We descended back into the ruins of Base 211. The black gate was still there, buried in the darkness, a silent giant. The carvings on it looked different, as if they had shifted ever so slightly since the last time we were here. As if something had moved. Carter ran his fingers over the symbols, frowning. "I managed to translate some of this." Reynolds folded his arms. "And what does it say?" Carter swallowed hard. "Here lies that which must not be remembered." Silence. "So that means..." I started. "That means the Nazis weren't trying to use whatever's in here," Carter interrupted. They were trying to bury it. Emily tensed, staring at the gate. Then why the hell didn't they just blow the whole thing up? Carter hesitated. Maybe because they couldn't. That thought hung in the air, and that's when Walker moved. Slow, calculated. His eyes locked onto the gate. What the hell are you doing? Reynolds asked. Walker ignored him. He raised his hand and placed it against the cold metal, as if he could feel something. We shouldn't be trying to leave, he muttered. We should be trying to open it. Reynolds drew his gun immediately. Walker, step away from the gate now. Walker laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was short, dry, wrong. You don't understand, Commander, he said. He's trying to show us something. Emily backed away, fear flashing in her eyes. Who's he? Walker turned to us slowly, and then he said it. He's already inside us. It happened fast. Reynolds lunged, tackling him to the ground, pinning him by the wrists. Walker thrashed, screaming nonsense, fighting to break free. And for the first time since we got here, Reynolds lost control. Do you think this is a game? He roared, yanking Walker up by the collar. But Walker just smiled and whispered something that made my blood run cold. You've heard his voice too, Commander. You just don't want to admit. Reynolds let go like he had been burned. Whatever was on the other side of that gate was already watching us. Walker lay still on the ground, his breathing ragged. No one knew what to do. Then he smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was wrong. You still don't get it, do you? His voice was low, drawn out. This was never a prison. Reynolds raised his gun again. Don't make me shoot you, Walker. Walker laughed, but the laugh didn't come from him. It came from behind us. We turned at the same time. Nothing. Just the black gate. Just the heavy shadows of the base, and then, again, the same laugh, but from another part of the bunker, echoing, like something was mimicking him. And then he attacked. Too fast. A blur rising from the floor. He grabbed Carter by the throat and slammed him against the cold metal wall. You need to see. He screamed. Emily tried to pull him off, but Walker spun, throwing her hard into a pile of equipment. I froze. Reynolds didn't. He charged and punched Walker so hard his body collapsed onto the floor. Walker coughed, spit blood, and laughed again. You still think you're really yourselves? He whispered. That's when Reynolds realized it. The bunker was changing. The hallways stretched. The walls felt farther apart. The shadows were wrong, moving in directions that didn't make sense. And then we heard it. You need to see. The same words Walker had just screamed. But it wasn't him. The voice came from behind us. Emily pulled herself up, shaking. Is there someone else here? And then, 1 second later, we heard our own conversation, but slightly different. Tiny errors, words out of place like something was trying to imitate us. But didn't quite understand how. Carter's eyes darted around, wide with terror. The space is shifting. This isn't the base anymore. But Walker just grinned from the floor and said the last thing I ever wanted to hear. The gate was never closed. Reynolds raised his gun, and this time he fired. The gunshot roared through the bunker. Walker stopped smiling. Silence. But the worst part? The voice was still there, repeating, mimicking, learning. Walker hit the ground motionless. The gunshot still echoed through the bunker, as if the metal itself had absorbed it. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, but no one celebrated. Reynolds slowly lowered his weapon, like he was trying to process what he had just done. Emily was breathing hard, clutching her arm, bruised from the fight. Carter kept his eyes locked on the gate, his face completely pale. I couldn't stop hearing the voices. They were still there, still whispering, still repeating our words, distorted, off like they were trying to learn. And then Walker moved. He wasn't dead. His eyes opened slowly, glassy, expressionless. A low, guttural laugh escaped his lips. A laugh that wasn't his. You think you can leave? His voice was weak, but there was something inside it. Something that wasn't human. He's already inside you. Reynolds looked at Carter and Emily. We seal this. Now. We grabbed the explosives from our gear and ran for the upper tunnels. Destroying the base wasn't an option. That could unearth whatever was down there. Instead, we needed to bury the entrance, bury the gate, bury all of this. Reynolds dragged Walker with him. He fought back, struggling, pleading. "You don't understand," he screamed, his voice breaking. "I have to go back." We didn't listen. With every step, the walls felt tighter, the ceiling lower, the whispers louder. They were everywhere now. Speaking. English? Speaking with our own voices. By the time we reached the entrance, Reynolds threw Walker to the ground and grabbed the detonator. He looked at us, took a deep breath, and said, "After today, no one ever comes back here." Emily and Carter just nodded, too shaken to say anything. Reynolds pressed the button. The explosion shook the ground, the air filled with dust and ice. The tunnel entrance collapsed, sealing the bunker shut in seconds. Walker was still on the ground, staring at the rubble, eyes wide. He was shaking his head, muttering something over and over. I stepped closer. "What are you saying?" He looked at me. His eyes were wrong, and then he smiled. A broken smile, and he whispered, "You think you closed the exit?" A chill ran through my spine. "What do you mean?" Walker's smile widened. And then, with absolute certainty, he whispered, "What if he never needed to leave?" We were evacuated from Antarctica a few hours after the explosion. The weather was unstable, and the Navy's forward base felt even more suffocating than before. The silence between us said it all. No one talked about what happened down there. Walker was taken into custody, but I doubt the Navy doctors got anything coherent out of him. He barely blinked, mumbling the same thing over and over. He never needed to leave. Weeks of interrogations followed. Cold rooms, bright lights in our faces, firm voices demanding answers we didn't have. What was behind the gate? Were the Nazis conducting experiments? Why did the 1952 team disappear? Emily stayed silent. Carter tried to explain what we lived through, but his words never made sense on paper. I only repeated the one thing I could say without sounding insane. The base was sealed. The mission is complete. That was all they wanted to hear. The final report was classified. No new expeditions would be sent. Base 211 officially never existed. Whatever was down there would remain buried under tons of ice and metal, or at least that's what we thought. 2 months later, Emily went home. She tried to move on, tried to forget, but something wasn't right. She started feeling watched. The TV changed channels on its own. The radio turned on at night, stuck on static. And then it happened. One night as she was getting ready for bed, the phone rang. She hesitated but picked up. At first only silence, then static, and then her own voice. Low, distorted, whispering words she had never spoken. He never needed to leave. Emily froze. The phone slipped from her hand. The static grew louder, filling the room. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The room fell back into silence. She stood there, shaking. The phone lay on the floor, then something caught her attention. The mirror beside her dresser. Her reflection was there. But, for just a moment, it blinked before she did. The story of Base 211 has never been officially acknowledged by the United States government. All records from the 1953 expedition were sealed under top classification, and any mention of the Nazi base in Antarctica was buried along with the bunker. But there's one thing no one can deny. In the years that followed, secret expeditions continued. Leaked reports mentioned military activity in the region, sensors detecting strange signals beneath the ice, and missions that never returned. The truth, they never stopped going back. And if that bunker was never just a Nazi base, and if something still there, waiting, watching, learning, the real question is, what exactly is the government still trying to hide? If you enjoyed this story and want more about the dark secrets they don't want you to know, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. There's a lot of darkness out there. And I promise you, this is not the only one. See you in the next video. Until then, Be careful with what you hear in the static. Subscribe for more stories like this.